Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving straight into the deep end of the human mind. We're pulling out the absolute most profound psychological lessons from Fyodor Dostoevsky's masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, and we're mapping them right onto our chaotic, modern lives. It is wild to think about, but Dostoevsky basically diagnosed the human psyche decades before modern psychology even had the words for it. And his insights on that constant tug-of-war struggle between our ambition, our intellect, and our conscience, they are startlingly applicable to the pressure cooker world we live in today. So let's kick things off with a massive question. What actually happens to your mind when your ambition completely overpowers your moral compass? Just imagine the inner conflict of a young guy who genuinely, truly believes he is completely above the rules. Our main character here, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a brilliant but totally broke student, and he isn't driven by some simple greed. No, he is driven by this incredibly intoxicating idea. He literally convinces himself that the normal rules of human decency just do not apply to him, simply because he's destined for absolute greatness. It is a deeply fascinating and honestly terrifying premise.
All right, moving right along to Section 1, the Superman delusion, or rationalizing the unethical.
Now, the core of this whole thing is what we'll call the Superman theory. Raskolnikov violently separates himself from the rest of society through this extreme intellectual arrogance. He starts looking at other people as nothing more than tools for his own grand master plan. In his head, he splits humanity into two rigid camps. You've got the ordinary masses, who just have to follow the rules, and then you have the extraordinary few, these supermen, who inherently have the right to step right over the law and even over human life to achieve their ultimate vision. Because of this, he actually rationalizes that murdering a corrupt, greedy pawnbroker to fund his own education isn't a crime at all. In his twisted logic, it's actually a public service.
And here is where it gets incredibly relevant for us. Raskolnikov famously idolized historical giants like Napoleon. He looked back at history and saw guys like Kyrgyz, Solon, and Napoleon shedding absolute oceans of blood, yet they were celebrated as these legendary lawmakers and heroes. He basically thought, well, if they can break all the rules for the sake of progress, why on earth can't I? Now, obviously, most of us aren't dealing with literal murder today, but think about the modern equivalents. We see this exact same dangerous rationalization in toxic corporate environments, where the end supposedly justifies the means. Think about the ruthless success-at-any-cost hustle culture. We constantly see leaders and innovators who believe their personal vision is so earth-shattering that they're totally justified in exploiting their workers, lying to investors, or completely trashing the environment.
Just listen to this quote from Raskolnikov himself. "I was ambitious to become a Napoleon. That was why I committed the murder." Wow, he actively convinced himself that taking a human life was just a simple mathematical stepping stone for the greater good. For him, this wasn't about survival in the slightest. It was pure, unadulterated ego. He desperately wanted to test himself, to see if he truly belonged to that elite, untouchable club of history makers. But spoiler alert, he very quickly discovers that murder is absolutely not a math problem. So let's bring this back to you. Think about your own life for a second. When was the last time you justified taking a harmful shortcut by just telling yourself it was for a good reason? Seriously, we all face this exact temptation to excuse our own moral compromises when our ego whispers that we're the exception to the rule. We are so good at constructing these elaborate, highly logical defenses for why it's perfectly fine to stretch the truth on a resume, or betray a friend's trust, or cut massive corners at work. We tell ourselves things like, well, I need this more, or I'm definitely going to make up for it later. Raskolnikov's story just takes this incredibly common, everyday human flaw and pushes it to its absolute fatal extreme. But of course, actions always have consequences. Let's head into Section 2, the psychological prison and the true cost of compromise. What Dostoevsky reveals here is absolutely brilliant. The real punishment for Raskolnikov isn't the police. It's not a physical jail cell. It is this agonizing, four-step descent into the complete chaos of his own mind. Notice how the actual physical crime happens super early in the story. The vast majority of the explainer isn't about him running from the cops. It's about him running from himself. And the irony here is just staggering. Almost the very second he crosses that moral line, his brilliant plan and all that cold hard logic completely shatters. He doesn't feel like a triumphant Napoleon. Instead, he is instantly swallowed whole by delirium, physical sickness, and an intense, overwhelming paranoia. It's like a psychological infection. We know that human connection is absolutely essential to our well-being, but Raskolnikov's terrible secret acts literally like a virus.
Researchers have described this perfectly. Severe violence and deep moral transgressions act as an infection that starts deep in the mind and completely dictates your behavior. His massive pride had already put a wedge between him and society, but his new guilt builds a 10-foot impenetrable wall. He aggressively pushes away his mother, his sister, his best friend. He becomes entirely trapped in solitary confinement, but the cell is inside his own head. His supposedly genius, perfectly calculated crime led straight to a devastating cocktail of symptoms: severe alienation, constant fear of discovery, and just deep, inescapable emotional exhaustion and burnout. There's an investigator in the story, Porphyry, who is a masterclass in psychology. He doesn't even need to use physical force to catch our guy, he just applies steady psychological pressure. Because he knows full well that a guilt-ridden mind will eventually demand its own punishment. Humans just aren't unfeeling thinking machines. We have a conscience, and when you completely divorce your intelligence from your morality, it inevitably turns inward and destroys you. So, how on earth do we escape this mental torment once we've crossed that line? Section 3, Healing Through Human Connection, the ultimate antidote to ego. Enter Sonia. She represents a completely different, almost radically opposing way of navigating pain. While Raskolnikov relies purely on cold, calculating logic and extreme individualism, Sonia relies on grounded human empathy, deep vulnerability, and an unbreakable connection to others. She is someone who has experienced immense, crushing poverty and suffering, yet she never once turns to cruelty or self-serving ego. She ultimately becomes the mirror that forces Raskolnikov to face the reality of what he's done. And the beautiful part? She doesn't debate his philosophy, she just simply mourns for his destroyed soul. There is a super fascinating detail you have to know here. The name Raskolnikov actually stems from the Russian word for schism or split. He is literally a man torn in half. One half of him is this arrogant intellectual who thinks he's a literal god, and the other half is a deeply empathetic, regular guy who intuitively gives away his last pennies to help a starving family. It perfectly captures that vicious war inside every single one of us, the battle between our prideful logic that desperately wants to hide our mistakes and our conscience that is practically begging us to connect and confess. True healing only kicks in when we drop the intellectual arrogance and finally embrace our shared human vulnerability. Raskolnikov only starts to genuinely regain his sanity when he stops over-intellectualizing his terrible behavior, steps out of his self-imposed isolation, and finally allows himself to feel actual compassion. Sonia urges him to confess, and not just to satisfy the police, but to literally heal his spirit. She tells him to go to the crossroads, bow down, and kiss the earth he has defiled. It's such a powerful metaphor. He has to literally lower himself, totally abandoning that Superman ego just to rejoin the human race. We absolutely cannot logic our way out of moral pain. We can only heal by owning it and being vulnerable. All right, let's bring it all home. Section 4, Lasting Peace Through Integrity, and how to finally escape the mental courtroom. So, how do we take these massive philosophical concepts and actually use them? First, we have to reject that toxic success at any cost mindset. We need to remember that intelligence must absolutely always be guided by a strong moral compass. When you mess up, accept personal responsibility instead of hiding behind a wall of clever, logical excuses. Prioritize your human connections over blind ambition. By applying these specific lessons to your career, your leadership style, and your personal relationships, you can totally avoid the psychological trap of self-justification. We might not be plotting grand historical crimes, but we all face choices every single day. Do we prioritize our ambition over our empathy? Dostoevsky shows us that true freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want without consequence. True freedom is getting to live your life with a totally clear conscience. So I want to leave you with this final, crucial question. Will you continue to build a mental prison brick by brick with clever excuses, or will you choose the lasting, genuine freedom of moral courage? Remember, lasting peace does not come from intellectual superiority or hitting some massive external milestone. It comes from living a life where your conscience can finally, truly rest. The next time you catch yourself building a brilliant, airtight, logical excuse for taking a moral shortcut, I challenge you to stop. Take a step back, recognize the mental courtroom you are building before you end up on trial against yourself. Choose vulnerability. Choose integrity. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.